believe that all of us probably got a very good overview, and I appreciate all the comments and questions that you have shared. So I'm going to take some other questions now, as we do have good timing to get us through. And for your questions, please type either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I will take the questions accordingly. So in order to answer all the questions, I will be bringing now Mizna and Siraj, and also Ali Adam to address some of these questions. So a couple of questions here, and not in any order, but in generally is how the questions came through. And there's one question that came. Probably I would like Siraj and Mizna, one of you, to take this question. One of the participants said, do you think this is good enough for all the employees, the minimum wage? What's your take on from a professional standpoint of view?
Thank you, Akif. I would definitely take this as a positive step forward. I would definitely think that there would be a group of Maldivian employees who would benefit from this decision of the government, and there will be an uplift of their take-home pay as a result of this decision. Yeah. So yeah. I think this definitely helps to establish a minimum social flow.
Yeah, very good. And I think the take there is, and obviously I have had this conversation also with quite a lot of HR professionals and obviously business leaders. And I think in most countries, or most of the time, we say, well, it's not the right time. I think there is no right time in the world order for any such thing to start. The right time is you start at one point, and then you have to keep, move forward with it and making it better. So I think it's a good point that you mentioned. Ali, I have a question for you from one of the participants. Mohammed Faisal said, do we have to pay 8,000 rupiah if staff work less than 48 hours? What's your answer to that? Ali Adam.
So minimum wage is set basically a monthly wage. So therefore, minimum wage is basically calculated based on hourly rate of work. So I guess that if the person, is not completed 48 hours or work less than prescribed time, then the person will not get 8,000. Siraj, jump in if it is wrong.
Thank you, Ali. No, I mean, our reading of the order is that the minister has set an hourly minimum wage, not a monthly rate. So the monthly rate that we have presented in our presentations is just an approximation. It's an example. It's an example
based on the 48 hours
to indicate roughly how much it works out.
There is no requirement in the Employment Act to contract somebody to do 48 hours of work. So you could contract somebody to do 40 hours of work or 10 hours of work even. So the minimum wage set is really an hourly rate.
I mean, interestingly, there has been research done on how it affects the way employees have been engaged. And in one study, there's a finding that setting a higher minimum wage leads to employers engaging employees for a shorter work hours, and thereby there's a hit on the employees' pay, but because they work less number of hours or shorter working hours with one employer, they tend to take up additional jobs elsewhere because they've got more free time now.
Yeah, very good. So I think the question is well answered. And now I would like Siraj and Mizna to take on this question. And the question is from Bagus, one BD from a hospitality professional. The question comes as, does the minimum wage can be, hold on 1 minute. I think I'll probably, yes, so there's two questions from Bagus, and one of them is the last question that came through here, which says that, what is the best way to keep the salary gaps between the rank and file and the above positions if the lowest salary will be increased to, let's say, up to an 8,000 rupiah? Does it mean the higher position will also be increased? What's your take on that, or what's your probably advice to organizations on how to balance that out? And perhaps Siraj and Mizna can take it, and then maybe Ali can add a point and thereafter.
I think that's a very good question. Definitely an issue that employers will need to tackle and need to budget on. I mean, we know that the law sets now, I mean, of course, pursuant to the powers given to the minister on the law, the minister has set a minimum wage that is applicable in the organization. There's no statutory regulation on the wage payable to higher employees. However, I mean, one needs to consider certain fundamental principles, such as, equal pay for work of equal value, which sort of implies that, let's say, if I'm paid the minimum wage, and if my colleague is doing, let's say, work of higher value, then he, she, or is legally entitled to a higher wage. One could argue that. But should it be in the same proportion? What's the timeline for implementing it? That can be discussed. What do you think, Mizna?
Yeah, I mean, the law doesn't really put a maximum on it, or nor does it give a range. In fact, actually, when the law was amended in last year, there was almost an indication that the minimum wage is going to be different depending on the sectors. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen, based on the size of the employer, there is one of the fundamental elements of the Employment Act is non-discrimination. And so could there be a discrimination claim coming in because it's not the same? But I think it's really has to come down to what is considered as fair and just. Ali could probably give more insight into how this would have an impact overall.
Yeah, Ali, what's your take on that? I think it's a good discussion going on there.
Basically, the main parity maintenance is very much dependent on the employer. What is the best parity? Can be arguable, as Siraj mentioned. This is about equal work for equal pay. If someone is adding higher value, then obviously he should receive a little bit higher salary than the junior person. If you look at companies within the Maldives or some of the larger companies around the world, mostly it is 10 to 25% parity they maintain. I'm giving you just an example how companies are practicing it, but I cannot definitely say the best for all this is 15% or any percentage. Yeah.
Can I add to this conversation?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I think here we need to understand that a minimum wage is not the same as the salary being paid. So it's up to the employer to determine changes to the net salary to be paid. If the minimum wage actually affects the bottom tier of a business, and there are ripple effects to staff that are above the bottom tier of the employees, it's up to the employer to determine how to apply such ripple effect. Will be a constant change? Is it a proportionate change, and so on? There is no requirement, or actually, the law and the order is both silent on this. So it's absolutely at the discretion of the employer to bring about such changes, so long as the minimum wage requirement is met. There's no additional burdens on the employer in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, Riyaz, for adding to that question, and also Mizna, Ali, to work on that. Siraj, Mizna, I guess you want to add something to that, or you're okay with that?
Maybe okay. I think we can take more questions.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, and good thing is we do have time. So Abdullah Adam asked a question: does the minimum wage can be counted including food, accommodation, or other allowances. And I also saw that there are other questions around the same topic, whether, for example, a fixed allowance that, for example, there are certain cases whereby a housekeeping attendant gets his minimum wage salary. I mean, that's his current salary, and then also he gets another $100 in allowance because he's he does an additional job, so you get $100 allowance. So the question, including all this, the question is, can you be a little bit more specific in regards to what allowances can be included or cannot be included? What's your
Okay.
take on that?
No, I think the short answer to that question is no, in the sense that the concept or the definition of minimum wage is in the order is basic salary plus fixed allowances, which is again defined. And there's a specific provision to say that variable allowances such as fixed service charge, overtime, Ramadan, those allowances are not included. Things like bonuses are not included. I think the kind of fixed allowances which are included would be, for instance, let's say if there is, let's say, a fixed allowance, let's say qualification allowance or something like that in the public sector, that's included, which is not variable and it's paid at a fixed rate. So there cannot be a deduction for provision of food or accommodation as such. No.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. And yes.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Yeah, adding on to what Siraj has said, in-kind benefits cannot be included in the minimum wage. But if you are paying a fixed allowance for, say, accommodation, you're paying 3,000 rupiah in cash every month for the employee. That can be counted as a fixed allowance. But what you have to consider is for this particular or other fixed allowances, even when the employee is on leave, these allowances must continue because it is with these allowances that the minimum wage value is attained. So if those requirements are met, I don't see any issue there.
Yeah.
But I think the consideration here is there might be other allowances such as incentivization allowances, daily attendance allowances, such. These would fall under the variable allowances category. So in that form, they cannot be included in the page. But you could restructure that to a fixed allowance. But then, of course, the company or the business has to decide what value it gives the company in terms of it's no longer motivational to the employer because it's a fixed allowance. So it's at the discretion of the employer to how restructure the current allowances that they are. Back to you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Riyaz. Now I'll take another questions there. Let's say, Ali, to you, there are, OT has to be calculated on minimum wage or the basic salary. What's your take on that, Ali Adam?
Basic salary hourly rate is already set. Therefore, it's very straightforward on minimum wage. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Rate, if the person's getting salary up to minimum wage level, if there is anything more than that, yes, obviously it has to be added.
Yeah, correct. Yes. Thank you. And Siraj and Mizna, what about part-time employees or freelancers or internships? Does the new regulation cater to this group in terms of minimum wage? What's your take on this?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question here, a bit of technicalities here. So the first question is if there is an employment relationship. So strictly speaking, an internship may not be an employment relationship. Likewise, a training contract may not be an employment relationship. So for one to be entitled to the minimum wage, there has to be an employment relationship. In other words, there has to be a service contract, an employment contract between the two parties. for a person to be entitled to the minimum wage. So internships may be excluded, trainee contracts can be excluded, but if somebody works part-time, or you may call it freelance, but I mean, again, the question is, whether this is a contract, whether this is a contract between two businesses, or let's say an independent contractor relationship versus an employment contract. So even if somebody works as freelance or part-time or on ad hoc basis, so long as there's an employment relationship, the hourly minimum wage will be applicable. But let's say if it's a business relationship or a contract between a business and an independent contractor, then the minimum wage is not applicable.
So, for example, So, for example, if there's a contract with an accountancy firm, it isn't, because it's a service contract. It's not an employment arrangement. But if there is an accountant that has been employed to come in and work 3 days a week, then that's an employment relationship, even if they're working 3 days a week.
All right, very good. So interesting question here again, coming from one of the participants. There were a couple of questions related to this. Since the application will only be for Maldivians at the beginning, what do you think will happen with those expatriate workers in general? And what's your take on this? I would probably first ask Siraj and Mizna, and then perhaps if Riyaz can add something to that would be great. So Mizna and Siraj.
That's a very interesting question. So there are certain things in the Employment Act that makes a distinction between locals and expatriate workers. For example, Ramadan allowance. It specifically mentions it's for Maldivians. Right now, the minimum wage has been, the order has been issued for Maldivians. So technically, it is only for Maldivians. Just like with Ramadan allowance, there has been employers that has given it to expatriates as well. Nothing to stop them from doing it. Nothing to stop the employers from having this minimum wage effective for the expatriates as well. However, we've also noted that the courts have interpreted the courts have made a distinction between benefits that has been given to expatriates and Maldivians, and have decided in certain circumstances that it is not discrimination. In particularly, for example, with accommodation, expatriates giving accommodation, because there is a regulation that requires the employer to provide that particular benefit. So in this instance, there is a law that requires this particular distinction. And so to give to minimum wage to Maldivians and not to the expatriate employee that might work the same job, right now, our understanding it under the interpretation that has been taken by the Supreme Court on the matter relating to the accommodation of expatriates, I think this would still be considered as allowed. Siraj? Do we agree with it is a different question.
No, I think we're going into an academic debate, whether the current position is consistent with the because on one hand we have the Constitution, which says every employee is entitled to equal remuneration for work of equal value. We have similar provisions in Article 4 of the Maldives Employment Act, which essentially provides that there should be no discrimination on grounds of race, color, nationality, etc.,
and not to mention ILO obligations as well.
I mean, our international obligations, our treaty obligations are very clear. Absolutely no distinction on grounds of nationality or race, and so on and so forth. So no doubt there's breach of the treaty obligations and comes to different treatment based on the nationality. So our Employment Act, as I said, provides for no discrimination on grounds of nationality, among other things, on remuneration. But then we had this, I would say, precedent-setting case involving a number of pilots who claimed that they are paid less as compared to other expatriate pilots who had same training, same qualification, same experience, but they were paid less total take-home pay because the expatriate employees were paid a very generous accommodation allowance and travel allowances. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that expatriates are expatriates. They are not in the same category as Maldivians. And there was a regulation which provided that expatriates should be paid with accommodation. And therefore, paying an extra but very generous accommodation allowance to an expatriate pilot, but not paid to a Maldivian pilot, is not discrimination. So now the current position is that it can be distinguished. I doubt it's the correct position or the correct intent of our constitution or our treaty obligation.
Yeah, and I think that links with what Ali earlier mentioned. So before Ali made a comment, Riyaz, do you have any comment on that? You want, because the question regarding at the moment, obviously, expatriate workers across the country will be exempted from this. And I suppose there's also another question: when do we would expect that perhaps the government will make a decision to include the expatriate workers? What I know you may not have the answer right now, but what would be your take on this question?
Yeah, I think both Siraj and Mizna has touched up on both sides of the argument there. There's also political arguments for this. In general, I think the initial proposal from the board was based on the feeling that, not on the feeling, on the numerical evidence that we saw that affording minimum wage to expatriates at this time, I should emphasize at this time, would burden our foreign currency reserves to a level that that we cannot really afford. So I think that was clearly the driving force for this exemption proposal. So I'm just trying to convey from where this thinking came about. But I think the arguments have been articulated by both Siraj and Ms. No comments, no further comments on this. But I'd like to add a comment to the previous question, where Siraj emphasized the employee relationship, and that is a very good way to define this. We might call it freelance, part-time, full-time, or by any other name, but it all boils down to what is in the Employment Act, and the Act defines what or who an employee is. The employee must have a contract, and there is requirements on what the contract must contain. So if these requirements are met, then I would believe that that's an employee. If it's not met, it's not an employee. So that's, I think, where this employee relationship comes from. Now, again, there'll be people who might have differing views, and then the recourse to that would be to go to the tribunal. And I must say that much of this part of the act has not been tested in the tribunal or court of law. So I do expect some people to take it up in that manner. So we'll see. Back to you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I think we'll keep on taking more questions, and this time I'd like to go with the question which is mentioned. I think we did touch base on that a little, but since there's a specific question, Asher mentioned in Siraj and Mizna's presentation, it says food allowance and travel allowance is not a fixed allowance. However, there are organizations paying a monthly fixed food allowance or transportation allowance or living allowance. Therefore, how do we define this? Could you please elaborate on this? Siraj and Mizna.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
Ali, can you please comment? We are trying to look up something.
Okay. Mansoor, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead with that question. Yeah.
Yeah. in terms of fixed allowances, I believe the board's proposal and the order includes language that uh, excludes certain types of fixed allowances as well. Typically, these would be um, how should I phrase this? Consumables relating to your job function. For example, um, you an employee might get a fixed allowance that fits the minimum wage requirements for mobile for your telephone. That's a fixed allowance, but that particular allowance is given to carry out his job functions. So that's a consumable towards his job. So I believe those would be excluded pertaining to the language that is both in the order and the board's proposal as well. So it's very important to read the definition for these types of things. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Riyaz. Siraj and Mizna, you want to add on to anything to that, or we're good?
The distinction is if it is an allowance that is based on the number of days that you work. For example, if the transport allowance is given, yes, it's given every month, but it varies because you might be required to work 25 days in 1 month as opposed to 28 days. And so the transport allowance that you get is different. Or similarly, the food allowance is different month to month because it depends on the day you show up to work. For example, if you're unwell, that might not be something that you'll be entitled to if you're on a sick leave or medical leave on that day. So it really does depend on what that allowance is. Is it tagged to a number of days of working, or is it just, for example, an accommodation allowance that you're given regardless of how many days you work? That would be considered as a fix.
If I may, we were referring to the order, and fixed allowance is defined in the order as any allowance agreed in the employment agreement, excluding basic salary, that is payable monthly without any deduction.
Yeah.
So the word fixed allowance here is any allowance that is paid without any deduction. So I think Asha's question is, and that's a very relevant question. It says, for example, let's say if somebody is paid a food allowance on every day he or she is required to go to airport, for example, then obviously that would vary depending on how many days he or she was required to go to airport in that particular month. Whereas, and then it becomes a variable allowance. Whereas if the employee is paid a fixed, let's say food allowance or travel allowance, regardless of the number of days he or she is required to do a particular activity, then it's a fixed allowance. So, I mean, that's the plain reading of the definition in the order.
I hope that makes it clear.
Yeah, I think it, and obviously we touched base there, and I would also recommend all the participants, I suppose, to read that. I think it's quite clear, and obviously one can always debate because in different companies the allowances or the type of allowances we give and how we give it is a bit different. So we probably won't have one definite answer, but I think the guideline in the minimum wage is what we can refer. And this time there's also a very interesting question. I'm not sure who really wants to answer this. I'll just read out the question. If a question is from Muhammad Atif, if an employee salary is $400 and pay an additional allowance of $119 to make it to $519 as minimum wage, can you explain the legal aspect of it? So the question, I suppose, means should we really make a new salary, basic salary is $519 to make it as the minimum wage, or can you just give an allowance so that you meet the minimum wage salary? What's your take on that question?
I mean, I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, the whole idea of the minimum wage is that the basic salary plus fixed or non-variable allowances should be monthly, should not be less than the set minimum wage. So, I mean, it doesn't matter whether the fixed charge, sorry, the basic salary is, a certain percentage of the minimum wage and the fixed allowance is a different percentage, but so long as the combined amount is not less than the minimum wage, that would satisfy the legal requirement.
Yeah,
And there's some consistency in how you done it. Like, for example, if somebody is getting basic salary at that amount, if you can add the rest of it to an allowance, as long as there's some logic in how that's done.
yeah,
Yeah, just to add to that, if it's a case of bridging to reach the minimum wage amount, an employee could just introduce a fixed allowance called ABC, and I don't see any issue with that.
Yeah.
So long as it reaches the minimum wage.
yeah. Good. And to Ali, there's one question here, since it's more related to resorts. It says, as you know, most of the resorts are getting service from outsourced companies. If the outsourced company falls under small and medium entities, will the minimum wage should not have an impact on resorts, isn't it? What's your question, take on that? Obviously, outsourced companies will have contracts with resorts, and resort will pay per contract basis. So I would think that this will not have an impact on your resort contracts unless the resort contract fees are reviewed with the third party, because up to the third party to decide on whether they are going to put their contracted employees on minimum wage or not. What's your take on that?
Thank you, Afif. I think you have given the answer to that. Because service contract is not an employment relationship, so therefore minimum wage is not applicable.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought. And then there's also a question from the Four Seasons team here, where they mentioned, Ali, probably you can lighten on this. Is there a suggested ratio that needs to be maintained between basic salary and fixed allowance? Example, 70, 30% or 80, 20%? Is there a formula that is there a best practice, better practice, international practice? Maybe Ali, you can share some insight, and then I'm sure Mizna and Siraj can share some light to that too.
Yeah, basically, if you look at the minimum wage order, it doesn't really say any percentage. It says that basic salary plus any fixed allowance. The reason why it was given, I believe, is mainly to restructure the salary in order to give maximum benefit to the employers. That could be the reason. If you look at Maldives context, there is a 7% of pension on the basic salary, and then again in the previous discussion, as Mansoor mentioned that the minimum wage was initially discussed only for basic, but we have to look at the order right now. At this point in time, there is no any percentage. Like, for example, you can either consider 10% of basic salary and 90% of fixed allowance. It depends, it depends on employer. You can either keep it 90% of basic salary and 10% of fixed allowance. So there is an avenue you can play with. And to say the best practice, I cannot really mention any percentage to share that, up to the employer, basically. Siraj.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ali. At the moment, there's no statutory regulation on what percentage the minimum, what percentage the basic salary should be. I mean, so long as the fixed basic salary plus fixed allowances is not less than the minimum wage, that's fine.
Yeah, good. And also there is, we continue with we have 10 more minutes. That's why we will continue with some of the questions, because we plan to end our session at 4 o'clock. So we've got 10 more minutes to go. And I'd like to take this question. Ali, since you put that on the slide, probably this links with that question. It says that it's from Mamdu. The minimum wage of MVR 8,000 per month was calculated considering 48 hours per week, and employment next says 24 hours rest needs to be given to employees to rest 6 working days, one off day, a paid off day, which is practiced by most of the companies. As per the new minimum wage, will be we will be paying for 26 days. What are we going to do with those 4 days? Isn't there any conflict with the current Employment Act? Also, service charge is payable to working days only or paid leave days as per the Employee Act. Can you explain what we should do, what we should consider these 4 days as not paid, unpaid days?
It's a very tricky question. I would like Siraj to say something first.
No, I'm trying to understand the question. I mean, maybe we can comment on the last bit first
Yeah.
while we try to digest the first part of the question. The service charge, now that's a matter regulated under law. The basic rule is that, service charge should be levied. There's a minimum percent of 10%, and it should be paid to all employees, and it should be distributed equally. So the employer's obligation to levy the service charge, distribute the service charge equally among all its employees, and the payment of the minimum wage, these are two separate mutually exclusive obligations.
Ali?
Yeah,
Can I?
yeah. Go ahead.
Afif, can you please rephrase the question? The first part of the question is, you understand it?
Yeah, I think what I understood from the question was that obviously we, with the new guideline and with the new order based on an hourly basis, we'll be paying for 26 days. So one is thinking that, well, what are we going to do with for those 4 days? If we're not, are we going to pay only for 26 days or for 30 days? And I think Ali in the presentation had you had that formula, Ali, where you described it. So probably that's where the participant came up with the question. And from what I understand, that we, for example, one works for a company, you actually get paid for 30 days. The pay is calculated on that particular formula. So it is a question that we can refresh or debate, but I think the point is, what are we going to do with those 4 days? And that's, I think, where the question came.
Yeah. Can I
Okay.
add to this?
Okay, if I may.
Okay, sure. You're right.
Well, I mean, let's go to the basics and the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Here, what we have is an hourly minimum wage.
Yeah.
So as far as the minimum wage order is concerned, and as far as the legal obligation of the employer is concerned, what is set is an hourly minimum wage. So whether you work on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, or whether how many weeks are there in the month, depending on how you calculate it, is all irrelevant. So the hourly wage payable to an employee, depending on the size of the enterprise, should not be less than the designated minimum wage. So there's no extra 4 days, so to speak, because there's no monthly minimum wage.
Yeah, I think Siraj has said it very, very succinctly there. I think we can rethink the situation by saying you could work 48 hours in 3 days of the week. So what about the rest of the days? Doesn't matter so long as the minimum wage amount is met. That's from the perspective of the minimum wage.
Yeah, that's right. Basically, minimum wage is hourly rate, and we know that 48 hours a week, that is considering 6 days times 8 hours a week. So therefore, if you annualize it and then make it to a month, so basically those 4 days are also paid. You will get at the month and 8,000. Basically, if your salary is 8,000, so there is no unpaid 4 days.
Yeah, good. So, Siraj, there's one more question to link you with our previous question. If there's used to the 400 basic salary and a company decides to give 119 to make it as elements and then total 519, can you explain from which amount we shall calculate the overtime and pension? Is it from 519 or $400?
Well, two different questions here.
Yeah.
The pensionable wage, one should see the Pensions Act. And as I understand, it's currently the basic salary. That's defined as the pensionable wage. For overtime, again, that's a separate obligation. And again, you got to see the law. As it stands right now, the overtime is calculated based on the basic salary.
Good. Yeah. And moving to another question here, we have, think one of the question is, when minimum wage is implemented, the hiring of local junior employees can become a burden as experts can be paid less wage than the local. If organizations start hiring experts for junior positions just to cover the cost, what actions can be taken towards them? I do understand there's a law passed to control the ratio. So I suppose a very interesting question here again, Siraj. I know we have addressed it a little bit, very similar tone in the question. So maybe Siraj, Mizna, you want to enlighten on this?
I think I'll take this question. Right,
Sure.
Siraj? Yeah, I think it's a legitimate question, but I do not
Yeah.
see this happening because there's no free movement of foreign labor.
Yeah.
You need permissions to bring in new recruits and such and so on. So there are controls in place, and at the same time, you have to consider that this is only a short-term moratorium. So anybody thinking, okay, we can do this, reduce costs by having foreign labor, that will only be a very short-term solution. That solution will not last. So I don't think that is a big concern. It's something we should be aware of and we should be guarding against. But I don't see it happening in a big way.
Yeah. Thank you, Riyaz. Siraj, Mizna, anything to that? Add on to that question?
No, I think that's fine.
Yeah, good. So we're going to take one more last question, and then we will do the closing remarks from each speaker. So the last question I would like to take on is from Atif. He addressed that to Siraj. Siraj, can you explain the legal framework of pay cycle in the Maldives refers to law?
Freedom of contract in one phrase. Essentially means that the employer and employee could agree for an annual wage, which can be paid in 12 installments, monthly salary. You could agree for weekly salary, bi-weekly salary, daily salary, hourly salary. It's entirely up to the employer and employee.
The employment law requires you to state how it's going to be done in an employment contract, but it's entirely up to the parties to agree on how that's going to be done. So you can agree to have a salary every 2 weeks. You can agree to have a salary at the end of every calendar month. It's a freedom of contract governs that.
Yeah, very good. So with this, I would like now to call upon everyone to make a closing remark in regards to, as this comes to effect on 1st of January 2022, what are some of the things that the organizations needs to be aware? What help, support, or helplines are available out there based on your knowledge? Obviously, organizations will need help in terms of understanding and putting this together. So Siraj and Mizna, probably for each one of you to make a closing remark on that.
I'll keep it very brief. Two things. Number one, the law mandates the minimum wage board to review the minimum wage at least once in every 2 years. I think the whole idea here is to make sure that the minimum wage keeps up with the inflation. I mean, if you look at certain studies done for other countries, you would see that the minimum wage keeps increasing, but at a lower rate than the national inflation rate. So for example, in US, they say that the effective minimum wage was highest in the 1965 as compared to the buying power. So that's the first thing. I think it's very important that the minimum wage board review. You don't have to wait for 2 years. Perhaps I would suggest the best practice would be to review the minimum wage once every year, of course, taking into consideration the economic situation and employability and so on and so forth. The other aspect that I would like to highlight, because we often talk about the impact on the enterprises because of potentially a higher wage bill, an aggregate higher wage bill because of this. I think one thing that we need to look for is increase in the productivity. I think even today, if you look at, for example, public sector versus private sector, I think you would see the discrepancy. Just example, I mean, if you take, for instance, the let's say the public service media, the MNDC or whatever it may be called. I mean, in terms of infrastructure, I mean, the office space, the land that they have, and the resources. I mean, few hundred employees. If you compare that with the private sector, for example, let's say Raja TV or Vila TV, they operate with less than 50, 60 employees. They have the same product essentially. So if you compare the budget of the public sector versus private sector, having the same resources, I mean, having substantially more resources in the public sector does not necessarily lead to a higher output or higher productivity. So I think one key consideration that enterprises need to look for is ways to increase the productivity of the workforce. Thank you.
I won't take much time because we're already at the hour. I think this is a very important development in the Maldives. As Siraj started off, we're now amongst the 90% of the world that does have a minimum wage. There is something to be said about that. It's really important, I think, to emphasize on what's the purpose of this law. If I was saying in the rule, what's the law trying to, the intent, what's it trying to achieve? And I think that's really important to keep that in mind as we are trying to quickly adapt to this new order that's come in. And we have 1 month to make sure that we're in compliant. And there's no indication that there will be an extension to this. So 1st of January is really when the clock strikes on this one. And I think it's really important that we emphasize on the core principles of employment law that is in our Employment Act as well. The importance of non-discrimination, the importance of maintaining the intention behind introducing this minimum wage, a much anticipated minimum wage. And so rather than having this be another tool to manipulate, I think it's really important to try and focus on the actual law that's coming. Yeah. And all the best to everybody who's involved in trying to make this effective by the 1st of January.
Yeah, thank you, Siraj and Mizna. Ali, any last thoughts from your side?
It is important to educate people, educate workforce as much as possible. From this 2 hours discussion, we got to know that still there are some gray areas people need to, answer. So it is very, very important to talk to the lawyers attached with your company and make sure that you are aware of what is being said on the order. And the other thing is cost implication and looking into various ways to make it more effective. I would say that read a little bit more. All those orders are there on the website, so you will get more information on it. And then if there is any question, I would always suggest to talk to the company lawyer and make sure that you are legally covered and understood it well. So that's it. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Ali. And Riyaz, any last thoughts from your side?
Yeah, a few quick points. Rely less on the media and actually read the order and read the relevant sections of the Employment Act and the SME Act. The SME Act lists the formula to be applied if your business falls into one classification on one parameter and another classification on another parameter. The formula will give you to which classification your business belongs to. It is important to emphasize that minimum wage has been set on an hourly rate. So I think the question was already answered. Like if you work less hours, yes, you will be eligible to an accumulated lesser minimum wage if you're working less hours. From the ministry side, we are working to publish the full registry of business classification. This would greatly contribute towards transparency. All the businesses will know the minimum wage that they are required to pay their employees, as well as the employees knowing what is the minimum wage they are entitled to. So quick updates there.
Yeah, Riyaz, thank you very much. And just to close, from my side, I, as an HR professional, I take this as an opportunity. I think as a nation, having a minimum wage is an opportunity. And I really like the point that Siraj mentioned. The purpose of a minimum wage, even in international best practice, is really to make the workforce more productive. Because you don't really have to make people work 8 hours. If you can manage with 5 hours, 6 hours per day, because a healthy workforce is a workforce that doesn't work long hours, yet less hours, obviously get paid a fairly amount for the skills and the productivity that they generate. This is really how we should take this into. And obviously, as international companies, we work on different methodologies on how we're going to implement. It's a good question whether we include expatriates or not. So my take on that would be we should try different options and really work on our numbers and see what makes the best sense for our business. So if your business can afford to give for all the expatriates the minimum wage, go for it. Why not? Or if your business can give a percentage of that, right? Because it is a very difficult situation where the nation is in and also the whole world is in. And that's the reason why I say it's an opportunity, because there really is no better time than now to implement it. Because if we had to wait for this to happen once the whole world recovers, which we don't know, nobody has an answer for it, we will have to wait for a longer time. So I want to take this opportunity and thank Riyaz, was the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Board to the Minister of Economic Development. And also I want to thank the Minister of Economic Development and the inter-government leadership interagencies that work on this, putting this together on behalf of MAHRP, our EXCO. And of course, Mizna and Siraj, taking your time on this Saturday, sharing your insight and really connecting us with, and of course, MAHRP General Secretary Ali, for sharing your quick insights. And I see that there's some messages that we have received, and also to my phone, I received some messages that you need further help. I think within our team, probably the best person to respond within MAHRP Exco is Ali. So with I guess with the responsibility I have as the president of association, I appoint you to be the focal point, Ali. So if somebody calls you, I think you can, I'm sure you wouldn't mind if someone calls you and really explain them, because like you said, and everybody said, it's important that this is communicated in a way that everybody understands the purpose of it and the opportunity that this is bringing and the way forward. And I'm sure if implemented correctly as a nation, we will grow, we'll have a better workforce, perhaps even a productive workforce. And also I want to, as we end, I want to thank Irasha for take us through the agenda part, though I led most of the Q&A, I suppose, just to look around. So once again, thank you all the participants. We will observe and see if there are more questions and things, and if we need to do perhaps a panel discussion over the next few days, we will bring that back again. So thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the day, and we look forward, obviously, for another event by MAHRP with the wonderful audience. Thank you very much.